My name is Debbie Porch, and I currently live in Tennessee. I'm married to Larry Porch, and we're both Bigfoot researchers. But I grew up in northeast Texas in a little bitty community, basically called Malta. And that was actually only about 30 minutes from Fouke, Arkansas. And so I've heard stories about the Fouke monster. That's what we called it growing up, and didn't know anything about what Bigfoot was or had never even heard that term up until probably, gosh, 25 years ago, maybe. But Larry and I got married, and we're both researchers, and I've just been interested in Bigfoot since we had them on our property there in Malta. And then when I married a researcher, you know, our two worlds meshed, and we research a lot now. And but that's how I gotten interested in the subject.
Hi, I'm Linda Eastburn of Linda Eastburn YouTube channel, and I have a new book out called Threshold to Encounters. It's about 40 years of research and experience with all of these wild cryptids that many of you I know have encountered yourself. You can find it on Amazon.com. Well, tell me, growing up near Falk, Arkansas, there's so much in the way of legendary stories down there. What do you remember that you heard as a child?
Well, I think I was probably 16 years old, and my daddy and I were out on the front porch. We lived in the country, and we lived down a dirt road, had a railroad tracks across from us, and we had always heard strange sounds. But we also had this little old lady that lived across the dirt road from us, and she had a ton of cows and bulls and chickens and everything. And anytime we would hear this deep sound, my daddy would always say, it's one of Miss Clay Schulte's bulls. And so this particular night, in December, he and I were on our front porch hanging blue Christmas lights. And they were the painted, the old school Christmas lights that had the paint on the outside of them. And so they were more of a muted tone. They weren't very bright. We had the porch light off so we could see, make sure all the Christmas lights were level. And we had started on the far end of the porch and was working our way towards the carport that was on the other end. And it wasn't a very big porch to begin with. But when we first started, we heard this really deep, just, it was, I called it a moan, a groan, and a growl, all kind of combined together. And it was coming from down the dirt road to our left, which was down where Miss Clay Schulte's house was. And I asked Daddy, I said, what was that? And he said, oh, don't worry, that was just probably one of Miss Clay Schulte's bulls. And so we just continued on, hanging the Christmas lights, working our way towards the center. And when we got to the center of the house, we heard it again, except this time it sounded like it was right in front of my mama's house, who lived just to the left of us. And it was very loud and a lot closer, of course, by this time. And it scared me. And I said, Daddy, let's go in the house. And he said, no, just go on in the house and get my gun. Well, now that scared me even more because my daddy was a Vietnam veteran, a World War II veteran, and a Korean War veteran. And I had never seen him ever get the least bit, not necessarily scared, but concerned even. And so when he told me to go get my gun or his gun, I knew he was concerned. And so I started begging him, Daddy, no, please come in the house. Let's go in the house. And he said, no, just go get my gun. And I continued on, come on, Daddy, please. About that time, we heard the sound again, but this time it sounded like it was coming just down to our left from where our carport area was. And now, we're out in the country, and this is a big old piece of land that we have. Like I said, my mama lived right next door to us, and we had a security light that was between my house and mama's house. But they're not very bright, and it was more towards the back of our house too. And so it was scary, especially this particular noise that we had never heard. It didn't sound like the cows and things that we had heard, in the past. And so I'm starting to cry, and about that time when this third sound came from the carport area, my daddy was concerned enough that he literally pushed me in the front door. And when you went in the house, you could go to the right or to the left. I went, of course, to the left, which where my mother was at. And I've got tears running down my cheeks and shaking like a leaf. And my daddy went to the right, which was through my bedroom, and came out on the other side that connected to the hallway. And he went into this other room and got the gun and came back out. And when she saw he had the gun, Mama started freaking out. And she was like, "Oh my God, what is going on?" Because here I am crying and shaking. And I'm telling her, just putting my hands up and trying to mimic the sound. And he goes out on the front porch. Well, that scared me because now I'm scared that my daddy's going to get hurt by this monster. Because that's to me, that's what I thought it was a monster. And so I go around the house following him as he goes around the house with the gun and the flashlight. And I'm looking out every window I can. And finally, he comes back in the house and he's like, "I didn't see nothing." And Mama's like, "What was it?" And he goes, "I don't know what the heck that was." And so anyway, he told me to go in there where our phone was because, back then we didn't have cell phones. And we had one phone that was in the hallway, basically, in this little room we had. And so he said, "Go call your Aunt Overly." Aunt Overly had lived there her whole life. And so he thought if anybody's going to know what this was, she'll know. And so we called her, and I'm doing this sound on the phone, telling her, roar, moan, growl sound. And she was like, "Oh, hon, don't worry. That was just probably one of Miss Clay Schulte's bulls." And we were like, "Well, it didn't really sound like that." But, she just said, "Well, there's certain things that can cause them to sound different." She went through this whole spiel and made us feel better, at least at the time. And so we calmed down. Well, then the next day, Miss Clay Schulte actually came to our house because my mother had cancer. And Miss Clay Schulte would come down there and give her shots when she needed them. And so when she came to the house that next day, my daddy went in there and said, "Well, Miss Clay Schulte, you sure gave us a scare last night." And she was sitting there in the rocking chair and just rocking. And she said, "What do you mean, Mr. Bob?" And he said, "Well, Debbie, come in." He called me in there and he said, "Come in here and do that sound that we heard last night from Miss Clay Schulte." And so I'm in there doing this roar, moan, growl sound for her, and you could see that she wasn't smiling. And she had this really concerned look on her face. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Bob, I wish you hadn't told me that because all of my bulls are up in DeKalb being bred." And DeKalb was about 7 or 8 miles away from our house. And so, we knew, well, it wasn't that then. But we never really thought about anything else that it could be. We had no explanation for it, even though we had heard of the Fout monster, but that was supposed to be, 30 something miles away from us. We never thought anything about where they could travel. There's possibly more than one of them, anything like that. And then fast forward several years later, my mama has passed away by this time, and my daddy's now living in Texarkana on the Arkansas. Well, he's right across the street because the state line for Arkansas and Texas goes right through Texarkana. And my daddy lived just across on the Texas side. And you could walk across the road and be in Arkansas where he's living. By this time, we had started hearing the term Bigfoot and the descriptions, putting two to two together, and like, that's probably a Bigfoot that we heard. So while I'm there at his house, I had been listening to Bigfoot audio at my house and heard sounds like what we had heard that night when we were putting up Christmas lights. And so I told him, I said, "Daddy, come over here. I want you to listen to this and tell me if you ever heard this before." Didn't tell him anything about what it was, or we hadn't even been talking about the past, about what we had heard at Christmas and stuff. And so I played the clip for him and I said, "Have you heard that?" And he said, "Good and damn well I have." Pardon my French. And I kind of grinned and I said, "Well, what do you think it is?" And he said, "Well, I know what I've always thought it was, but tell me what you think what it says it is." And I said, "Well, it says it's a Bigfoot." And he just kind of grinned and nodded and he goes, "Yeah, that's what I always thought." Well, then I got kind of, I was surprised, because like I said, we had not heard the term Bigfoot back then. We'd only heard the fat monster. And I said, "What do you mean that's what you've always thought?" And he said, when he started hearing the term Bigfoot, that he just kind of figured that's what it was. He said it wasn't anything I've ever heard in my life. And he's been all around the world, or he had been at the time. And I said, "I wish you'd have told me." He goes, "Well, I didn't want to scare you or your mama." And so that's when my real fascination, I think, with the subject began, because Daddy started telling me stories that he had heard just in the past few years, because he would talk to some of, the people he knew that he worked with. He worked at Red River Army Depot, and there were people from all around the area that worked out there. And so he mentioned it to some of them, and some of them had already told him what they thought it was. And so he kept that from me forever. But that really, you know, piqued my interest. And I think that's basically when I really started researching. But back then, I was just researching on the computer and wasn't going out into the field.
So when did you start actually going out in the field, and what were your experiences when you started researching?
Well, let's see, it was several years ago. I went to a conference that was in Jefferson, Texas, a Bigfoot conference. And I lived in Longview. I wasn't very far from Jefferson. I was married with children at that time. And it was probably, I would say it was probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago when I went to that. Might have been 10. I'm not real sure. And I met some people there that I'm really good friends with now, but had never met them before. It was nice to meet people in the area with that common interest. And I didn't know that there was a whole lot of stuff on Facebook or the computer or anything really, as far as groups like we have now. And so I went to this conference and met a lot of people and some ladies from the area. And we all had just this fascination with it. A couple of the ladies had them on their property. And we decided we'd all go camping together first. And we had activity then. And then we decided we would continue camping. And we started the group, called it Sisters of the Moon, because we ended up feeling like sisters. And we got so close. And of course, what we do now, it's usually, at nighttime under the moon. So we thought that was pretty fitting. But that's how we all got together and started the group and became researchers.
And what have you found out there in the field researching?
Well, we've been really fortunate, really lucky. We think it's because we're women, and the fact that we don't camp with any men when we get together. Of course, I do go with Larry and some other friends at times, but when we go as a group, usually it's just two or three of us women. We have had times when there might be five, but on most occasions it's just two or three. I just got back from a camping trip this weekend, and it was just two of us. And we've had a lot of activity. We've experienced a lot of things we never dreamt that we would experience or find or hear or see. I've seen a Bigfoot. I saw one in Sam Houston National Forest in 2016, I believe it was. It was 16 or 17. Excuse me. Um, and we were fixing to go on a midnight hike. It was about 12:30 at night, and two of us were pulling in my truck to park at a trailhead. And as I'm pulling in, my lights, kind of curve around. I'd never been to this area before. And as I'm following the curvature of the parking area, I didn't even know that there was a parking area there. I'm kind of angling around because I see that it's got a curve there. My lights are going from my right to the left. And as they're doing that, a Bigfoot comes running down this hill that I didn't know was there. I couldn't even tell it was a hill at the time, or it's basically not a hill, but a slope that went down into a creek bed right there. And I couldn't even see the creek bed because I was up higher. And as my lights went that way, it was going the opposite direction. And so they crossed and it lit it up. And I hollered to the girl that was in the truck with me and I said, "Oh my God, I just saw a Bigfoot." which like I said, I was shocked. And I circle around really quick to try to catch it in my lights again. Did it again and again, but it was gone. And I couldn't understand how it had disappeared so quickly because I mean, I whipped around there pretty fast. And I couldn't see, why, where it could have gone. I was backing up and kept angling my vehicle in the direction that I thought it would have gone in. But when I went back the next day during the daylight, I saw that there was a creek bed down in there. And of course, needless to say, we didn't get out and go on a hike. We were relatively, we had had some good things happen. We had recorded the gibberish by this time. But as far as seeing one in person, I had never had that happen, and she hadn't either. And so we were like, well, we basically got what we came for, so I'm good to go back to camp. And we went back the next day, or I did. She had to leave. It poured down rain all night long. When we got back to camp, it just started pouring down, raining. We had a little stream going down the side, each side of our tent. And so when I got back out there to the hiking trailhead that we had the sighting at and walked up to where the sighting was, I could see that there was a creek bed down in there and it was flowing pretty good then. And so I called who was now my husband at the time. I called Larry, and we weren't married then, but I called him and I was telling him I'm out here at the trailhead. I told him about the creek. There was a guy that had just came up while I was there, and that's why I called Larry because I was out there by myself. Carrie had to leave and everything, and so I'm walking back, following the direction that it had come from when I saw it the night before, and I didn't see anything along the creek or anything. So I went up on the sides of it and into the woods and walked back. And I did find what looked to be a good print, actually. And it was in the woods. And so I just took pictures of it. I went out to my car to get casting material, but I didn't have enough to fill the whole print up. And so I made just what I could out of it. It ended up breaking, but I took a lot of pictures of it and measured it, of course. And it was 16 and a half inches long and 8.5 inches wide. And I thought, okay, well, that's much bigger than a human print. So I just ruled out that that print was from a human. But anyway, I went back and told some friends that are from the area and they go out there and research a lot. I told them what trailhead I had seen it at and told them that it was either white or a light gray. I didn't know if my headlights lighting it up, had caused it to look more white or what, but I said it was one or the other. And they said that there was a light gray one that had been seen out there a few times before in that same area. So that was my sighting. And that just got me hooked even more.
So have you ever gone back to that same place and tried to explore it further?
Yes. Yes, we've gone out there quite a few times. We've camped out there in Sam Houston and can't say we've ever had anything like that before, but we've been very fortunate to hear things. In Sam Houston, we ended up camping when we had a tornado, and so we only got to stay one night, and then we had to get out of Dodge basically because there was a bad tornado heading towards us. And so we haven't gone back there in quite a while. It was a good little drive from where I lived in Texas at the time. And so, but we've been out there probably, I'd say probably 4 or 5 times.
Well, it sounds like you have had quite a bit of luck. So what are the sounds like when you're out camping? What all have you heard?
Oh my gosh, we've heard so many things as far as the sounds that we think Bigfoot makes itself. We've heard howls, moans, groans. Um, of course, there are normal calls that I'm sure everybody's familiar with. We've heard whoops. One thing that we've heard quite a bit, and I'm sure that there's others out there that have heard this too, but we found it really interesting, especially the first few times that we've heard it. Um, it's, they mimic a lot. And we heard what would start out like a moo sound, like a cow, and then it would turn into a moan at the end. And we thought that was really interesting. We've heard a lot of, like I said, mimics of different animals. And the only reasons that we, on some of these occasions at least, that we believe it was a possible Bigfoot doing this is because the sounds would be just a bit off, and not like a normal animal of that species that it's mimicking would necessarily do. Just like those moo moans. They start out good, sounding like cows, but then they turn into that moan at the end. And then we've ended up, when we've heard that, they've ended up coming into our camp, and sometimes they get awfully close. We've had them hit our tent, throw rocks at us while we're sitting out around the fire, um, drag things down our tent, just all sorts of stuff.
These sounds that you've heard out there, have you heard anything that resembles the Sierra sounds, the chatter that?
I've recorded gibberish. I do have gibberish recorded. To me, it doesn't sound really that much like the Sierra sounds. Although when I first recorded it, I contacted Rod Moorhead, of course. He's the first person you think of. And he was going to try to get in touch with Scott Nelson to see if Scott would listen to him, because Ron Moorhead told me that it reminded him of what he recorded. But to me, it just sounds different, really. I don't recall hearing anything like this, and at least what he's put out for the public. I don't know if there was more maybe that he heard, but anyway, he contacted Scott Nelson, and Scott was retired. And so then he recommended David Ellis of the Olympic Project to analyze it, because I didn't have a very good computer really back then, especially anything or any equipment like what any of them had. And so David Ellis analyzed it. He said that as he worded it, it was the best piece of audio to ever come across his desk. And that's what he said. He said it was faster than humanly possible. And anyway, it was really interesting.
And so he said it was faster. Did you get any other feedback from him?
Well, like I said, he said it was the best piece of evidence like this to ever come across his desk. He told me all about the different ranges and everything in it. Of course, this all went over my head. Um, he said at one point that it sounded like possibly two talking, but to me, it just sounds like the same creature. But he said he thinks it might possibly have been two talking back and forth. Now, we did hear this with our own ear as it was happening. And I think there possibly could have been two beings out there talking, but on the audio, to me, it just sounds like one. The night the audio was recorded, it was just two of us camping. We had two other girls in our group that were supposed to come, but one of them, we never knew when she would show up. And then the other one wasn't going to get there until the next morning. And so the night that the recording was, that the gibberish was recorded, it was just me and another lady. And we had been experiencing all sorts of stuff that night. This location is where the gibberish was recorded, is called our Tribulation Bay location. We named it that. We had been asked to speak at a get together, not really a conference, but anyway, a get together. So we had been asked to speak there, and they had asked us to speak about the trials and tribulations of being female researchers. And so that night, with all the stuff that we had experienced, just the two of us, we didn't get to work on that speech any at all. And when the girls came the next day, we talked a little bit about it, but we were now focused on the activity that we had had the night before and preparing for hopefully some more that second night. And we ended up naming this place Tribulation Bay. because of the what we were there for in the first place. But the activity that we had had in association with the gibberish that night, I mean, that night before the gibberish was recorded, it was the same night of the gibberish, but it was prior to it, to us hearing it. Um, we had had all sorts of stuff happen to just the two of us. We were hearing what sounded like moves outside, but prior to that, we had heard up in the woods were we were in the woods, but there was kind of an incline out in this area that we were camping out. And where this incline, we just call it a hill, but it's not really a hill even. But where this hill area was, is where everything started. And we kept hearing what sounded like an animal. And then we'd hear something that sounded like a power saw. And we're like, now that didn't make sense to us. At the time we had heard that they do mimic animals. And so when we heard like a sick chicken, that got us excited. First of all, we knew there weren't any chickens around. We had came into this area, been all through that area, and it's a long ways. It's very long ways from any farm animals. And there's cows way on back, but they're several miles back down this dirt road. And so we knew that there weren't any animals there. We had also hiked all through that area. So when we heard the sick chicken, we thought, oh, we both smiled, thinking, oh, that's not a chicken. And if it is, it's a sick chicken. And that's what we said and kind of laughed about it. And that's why we call it the sick chicken. And but we heard a sick chicken, and then we heard what sounded like a power saw. We heard a whimpering dog, cow moo, but they were all coming from the same exact location, just right across from us up this little incline there in the woods. And so after the next one that we heard sounded like a bear, like it was trying to mimic a bear. And it was a pretty good mimic. Now we know that this was in Southeast Oklahoma, and we knew that Southeast Oklahoma was supposed to have bears. And this one sounded very good. It wasn't off like some of the other ones had. And so with that, we thought, well, we don't have bear spray. And if that is a bear, I don't want to take any chances. The other sounds that we were hearing from the same location, we were pretty sure that this is not what we're hearing, that it's something mimicking it. But for all we knew, a bear could have come up there. So we decided that we would go into town, which was about a 30-minute drive or so, and try to get some bear spray just in case. And so that's what we did. We put recorders out before we left because we had just gotten there prior to all of this happening with the mimicking starting. And so we put recorders out, or I set one out. I don't believe she set any out, but I set one out, and it was on the back end of a trailer that she had pulled. And I don't mean like a camping trailer, but just a flatbed trailer because she was hauling. She had a four-wheeler that she had brought and stuff. And so I just turned the recorder on and laid it there on the back of that trailer and left it. And we drove into town and got what we needed and came back out. And later on, after I listened to the audio, that whole time that we were gone, it was dead silent. Not a sound, not a peep, not a moan, a groan, a whistle, nothing. But as soon as we got back, it all started back up again.
Well,
And
that's
I found that
interesting. Yeah.
really interesting.
One thing I wanted to ask you, the gibberish tape that you had, or the recording that you had of the gibberish,
Mhm.
can people hear that anywhere? Do you have that up someplace?
Yes, we've been on a lot of shows, and so I've played it on a lot of things that we've been on. Beast,
Would you be able to send it to me and I can attach it to
yeah,
this one? Okay,
yes, I would definitely do that.
we'll put it up with
Uh,
this one.
I know that Beast TV, it's Bigfoot Evidence Analysis Sawdust Team, but they always just use the letters, and it's spelled out Beast, and they called it Beast TV. But it has, my husband is Larry Porch now. We've married since we've been together for 7 years though. But they are some of the first ones that I played it for,
Okay.
and they have it on their
Okay.
website. And
We'll get it up on here and so people can hear it. I just know that
okay,
when you hear about something that exciting, people just
yeah,
want to hear it, of course. So we'll get it up.
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, it was really strange that we thought, that here we're hearing all these different animals coming from this one spot right there in the woods. And then the whole time we're gone, there's not a peep, not a sound. And then when we get back, it starts back up. And so we were very hopeful, and at the same time a little nervous. And it's that nervous energy that you get. And so we sat outside and put our chairs facing that way into the towards the hill, what we call the hill. And we sat there and listened and everything. We started having things kind of, we'd hear movement out there, and then we'd hear things like it was falling in front of us. So we don't know though if it was rocks being tossed or acorns or what. We didn't see any of that. But that night after we decided we'd go on in the tent, that's when it really picked up. And it was still just the two of us. One of the girls always showed up. You never knew what time she was going to get there, and she'd show up usually in the middle of the night. And then the other, Barbara, came the next morning. But the girl that I was with, her name was Carrie. We sat out there for a long time, and then we finally decided we'd go inside the tent. And once we went inside the tent, is when everything amped up.
So what
And
happened? What all happened when you say amped up? Obviously, a lot of
yeah,
it occurred.
yeah, they came in to our camp area. We had one of the larger tents, and off the back side of the tent, it was a little closet area. I think that's what it was supposed to have been used for. It kind of jutted out a little bit, and it had flaps on the inside of the tent, and we put a bucket in there, and that was our little potty area. And because at nighttime, if you're having Bigfoot activity, you don't want to go out in the woods to use the bathroom. And so we put a bucket in there and had a little toilet seat on it. So that was our potty area. Carrie was on one end, and she was on the end that was closest to the area where the hill was that I'm talking about. And then I was along the front of the tent faced out to where we would pull in, and our vehicle was out there. And then everywhere else, all the way around us, all the way, it was heavily treed. But where the vehicles were, of course, it was a little more cleared out. But so once we went inside the tent, that's when things amped up, and they came into, I don't know if it was one or two. We think there was possibly two because of the different locations that things were happening on our tent. We think there had to have been two, but that's just our thoughts. It could have been one, and it was just moving fast to get to the other side. But they it would drag either its finger or a branch or something along the roof of our tent. And this is a tall tent. We could stand up in it, and it went up just like a regular roof did. And it looked like, to me, it was dragging a finger down the length of the tent, the roof. And at one point, it was hitting our tent. And the reason we think it was two is because we're watching this end of our tent, because that's where it was hitting it so much. But then just within a second or two on the other end of our tent, something would hit it. But we could see, we always use twinkle lights. I should have prefaced by saying that we put twinkle lights around the tent as much as we can, but we leave big spaces between it because we wanted to be able to see their shadows if anything ever happened. And it really pays off. And we've been very fortunate to be able to see their shadows a lot of times that we've had activity. And this particular night, I think we just had maybe two strands of twinkle lights, but they were set pretty far back. And so we could see movement, but we couldn't see their complete form, if that makes sense. And but we could see that they were running around the tent. And then the lights went out relatively quick. We This was pretty early on as we had become a group. And so we weren't like, didn't know how to set timers or anything on the lights to get them to stay on longer. And so these lights went out pretty quick that first night, but it was going around the tent, dragging its finger or the sticks along the roof. They would hit the tent. We'd be able to see their whole palm, and they were spread out like this. Um, at one point, one had hit the end of the tent that Carrie was on her. She was on her cot actually at that time, and it hit the tent, and she got down in the middle. But just within a second or two, one hit the other side of the tent, and we actually could see its fingers and everything because it was splayed out, and its hand came in, and my cot leg. You know how cot legs they crisscross, and they're a good distance from the end of the cot. That tent wall came in very close to that cot leg underneath it. And so it had hit it pretty hard. And that's how we realized there were two of them out there at that time. And anyway, the activity would constantly go on for it lasted at least 2 hours, probably three. And we were trying to text the other two girls to tell them, where are y'all at? Y'all need to come on out, get on out here fast because we've got stuff going on. You're not going to believe this. But we didn't know it, but we didn't have very good signal and they weren't going through. I think one of the girls got a few of them, but they couldn't reach us. They couldn't text back. We never heard anything from them. So anyway, we kept getting up and down to the point to where things would die down, and we'd get back up on the cots because we were getting worn out. I mean, it was getting late. It was probably 2:33 in the morning. Um, oh, at one point, this was really, I've told this story so many times. I don't want to forget this. We were hearing the moo sounds that weren't just quite right, and but then those stopped, and we heard what sounded like a cough, a two-syllable cough. And when we heard that, it was coming from right out in the direction basically that our cars were parked. And Carrie and I were talking, and I'm like, that sounds like a human cough. And that concerned us. And that's what's sad too, is, we're scared of humans, especially humans we don't know. And but we were excited about this Bigfoot activity. And so now we're worried that there's a human out there. And that's really a sad thing, isn't it? That we're not scared of Bigfoot, but we're more worried about a human being outside our tent. And so we wanted to make sure that this was not humans out there. And so we both have guns, and we got our guns, and we stood at the door of our tent. And this was the door that was on this tent, had one of those poles that goes down inside of it where you could and then Velcro along the door, where instead of zipping it, you could Velcro it. Well, we only had it Velcroed. And so when you hit the door, it swings open like a regular door. And so we stood there by the door, and we waited until we heard the cough. And then we just went out of there, and we joke around saying it was like Charlie's Angels because we had our gun. And, we get out there and we got the gun and a flashlight in one hand, and hoping we were going to catch a guy or something. But there was nobody out there. And that's what we expected. We seriously thought this was such a human sound, that this was a person, but there was nobody out there. And so now we're like, that was a really good mimic. And so we go back in, and we're talking while we're sitting there in the tent, and we start hearing the two-syllable cough sounds again. And so we're like, okay, this time we'll wait until we hear it and it sounds close. And we had our key fobs for our vehicles. So we decide that we're going to wait until we hear one that was closer in to the tent. And then we would zap the lights because, you can use your key fob to where you can start it and the lights will come on your vehicle. And so we waited until we heard that. And when we did, we hit the key fobs. Our lights on our vehicles came on. We went out the door just within a split second of all of that taking place, hoping that we would catch one in the headlights of our vehicle. And of course, nothing to be seen. And so we had to go get in the car and kill the lights and the motor and everything. And we go back in. And so we're in there, and all during the night, things would happen, but they started getting further and further apart as far as the time frames. And they were dragging their fingers or sticks or whatever, still hitting the tent. We could hear them running around, everything. We knew there were two, but finally, the distance between the happenings started getting bigger and bigger. And I would be laying. Finally, I just, instead of getting up in the tent, I was getting up and down so many times in the middle of the tent that I just decided to lay there on the tent floor, and that's where I fell asleep. And anyway, the next morning, we didn't know it was morning, but we woke up hearing something outside. And I remember thinking, oh God, not again. It's starting up again, which is crazy because that's what we're there for. But we were worn out because we had had so much activity that, during the night. And so when I open my eyes, I see it's daylight. So I unzip the door just to look out, and I see that one of the other girls is out there. And it was approximately, I think, 6:30 in the morning when I ended up looking at my clock. But when I went out there, her nickname is Henry. And I was like, where have you been? Oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what happened last night. And so she just stops me in my tracks and puts her hands up. She goes, hold up. Before you tell me anything, let me tell you what I saw when I pulled in. And she was notorious for coming in the middle of the night. We never knew when she was going to show up. And so she reached down and she lifted her leg back, where you just have the part below your knee up in the air, that behind you. And she did like the running stance, and with that one leg up, and she reached down and touched the calf of that leg, and she goes, I saw this running away from that side of the tent, which was my side of the tent. And she said when she was looking at it at that time during the daytime, she's looking and she can see that there's a ridge line right there. And she said it went down that ridge line and just disappeared into the night. Now, this was her first time to actually come out and be in this particular location where were camping, because when we had kind of scouted that area prior, we were back further up where where it's more heavily wooded, even though this is pretty heavily wooded too. But the area she had been in was further back down the road that she had come in on. So she wasn't really familiar with how our camp was going to be set up or anything. And so when she said, I saw this and pointed to her calf and everything, running that way, I'm like, yeah, well, there's a good reason why you saw that, because they were messing with us all night. And she had not gotten any of the texts. We had a group chat. So her and Barbara, the other two that were in the group, they could have gotten them, but they just weren't going through. And anyway, Barbara ended up coming later that day. And then that second night, we had some more activity, but nothing at all like that first night. And we've had tons of activity out there. It's been a wonderful, wonderful place. It's probably my favorite place out of all the places we've been. And but that was really our first big activity, I think, as a group.
Well, it sounds like you've had a lot of varied experiences. Um, some people report, some unusual activity when Bigfoot's around. Have you seen anything odd that has happened out in the woods?
Yeah, yeah. We've seen, not just me and the girls, but Larry, my husband, of course, is a researcher as well, as I mentioned previously. And before we were ever married, I would I lived in Texas and he was in Tennessee. And so we would meet in the middle a lot, or I would go on up to where he was at in North Tennessee. And I would go out with him and his research partner and another friend of ours. And we would go to Land Between the Lakes a lot, which is on the Tennessee Kentucky state line. Excuse me, I got to up a little bit. And I had heard a lot of people talking about orbs and lights and things like that, and that they thought that they were associated with Bigfoot. And at the time, I had never experienced any of that, even though we had, by this point, we had had quite a bit of activity, lots of different kinds of activity uh, that we would relate to Bigfoot. But for some reason, I don't know if I didn't want to believe that the orbs were somehow associated with them. I wanted to believe they were all flesh and blood. And I was pretty adamant about that for a long time. Um, but there at LBL, I witnessed some orbs, and it was me and Larry and another good friend of ours named Dan Rickey, who is an older gentleman, and he has been researching for probably 45 or 50 years by now. I believe he's around 75 years old. Um, and he has done a lot of research, and he was with us, and Mark Newell, and I believe there was somebody else, but I can't quite remember. But we had gone out to this area where Larry and Mark, who were research partners at the time, they had recorded 13 howls, and we pulled over on the side of the dirt road where they had done the recording a while back, and it's a big field, but the field is surrounded by just solid thick trees, and the back of the field was very similar to our Tribulation Bay location in the fact that it went kind of uphill the further back, that it went, and it was along that hill line where the thick trees began there and then went down each side all the way back out to the dirt road. And then everywhere around that, even back on the other side of the dirt road, is nothing but solid, thick woods. And all you've got is this little field. And that's where they had recorded all of these howls that they had. And so we had decided that we would go there and do some calls. And so we go out there and we're standing on the dirt road. And of course, it's pitch black. And I don't believe there was a moon that night that I can remember. And I want to know where everybody's at that's with us. And so I'm keeping an eye on the guys, Dan and Mark. And of course, Larry, he pretty much was staying close to me. And we're standing facing the field, and Mark starts walking off, goes back behind me and starts walking off down the dirt road. Well, like I said, I want to know where everybody's at. And so I turn and I'm looking at Mark, and up above Mark, I can see this orb. That's the only way I can explain it. I thought at first that it must be an airplane, but because it was just a ball of light and it was white. And I'm looking at it, just staring at it, and it's going very, very slow, and it's moving from my right to left. And of course, now I'm looking down this dirt road, but up in the sky, and it is right at the start of where the tree line is. And it looked like it was just above the tree line, but further on past it, but it just appeared to be above it, and it's white. But you can see that there's this swirling looking stuff inside of it. And as it's moving to the left, it starts changing colors. And it was solid white, and it was very bright. And so I hit Larry, who's standing kind of to my left. And so I hit him on his back. And as he turns, I point, and it's going from white and it starts changing very slowly to this pale pinkish color, but it's not like automatically filling up the whole orb. It's moving from one side to the other, and then it becomes a solid pale pink color, and it's getting to be about the middle of the tree line now. And so now Larry and I both are watching this orb. And as it becomes solid pink, um, then it starts changing from this light pink color to where this red tint starts taking over. And it's moving further and further to the left, and it's getting really close to where that tree line is about to intersect with the other tree line that's along the hill in front of us. And by the time it gets almost to the end of that tree line where it's going to intersect, it is now a solid red color. Well, just about that time while the two of us are still watching this, Dan Ricky was behind us, and he does this call that we don't know he's going to do, and it's the Bigfoot call. And he does that. I immediately turn around to make sure it wasn't a Bigfoot back there and see it's him and turn right back around. I mean, this is like in a split second. And I look back at the area where that orb had been, and that orb is gone. But Dan has ended his call, and just in that split second, there's a call back coming from that corner where we had been looking, and Larry's looking too, and up way up higher now, up above where that orb was on the tree line, way up high in the sky, we see this bigger orb, and it's this gold color, and it looks like it's full of gold glitter, like it's just kind of swirling, but it's falling out of the sky, but it's coming from way up higher than where that red orb was the last we saw it. And so now it's falling out of the sky, and there's little, looks like little sparkles of glitter falling down from it. And then it just totally disappears. It doesn't, it barely gets down to where the tree line had been, and it just totally disappears. But when it disappears, there's a callback, a return call, like an answer to Dan's call. And I was like, holy crap. Because for a long time, I had been hearing people talk about they thought orbs and Bigfoot had some sort of relationship going on, that somehow they were connected. And I was like, no, there's no paranormal stuff to Bigfoot. They're flesh and blood. I was trying to just deny any of that possibility as long as I could. But when that happened, I don't know, I couldn't explain it. And then, I've experienced a lot more stuff since then that I can't explain. And so I think that made me shift my thoughts on what they are. And I still want to stay with the flesh and blood, but a little bit more. They're a little bit extra. And
Well, you
so
said
I
that there
just,
were a lot of other unexplained things that happened. Like what else has happened?
well, one time we were camping, the girls and I, and we were camping in a place that we call the killing field. We name our places usually. It's just easier to refer to them when we're talking about them. We had found a whole bunch of cow bones that were just all scattered out through this field, which it's the woods. We just call it a field, but it's heavily wooded as well, and it's by a river, and it's surrounded on one side, with water. And where we camped down from where this killing field area was, and so there's water on like two sides of us. And we were camping, and there were three of us camping. It was me and Carrie, the girl that was with me at the when we heard the moo moan sounds. And it was me and Carrie and another friend of ours named Patty, who I just got through camping with yesterday. And we camped all weekend. Anyway, it was the three of us camping, and Patty and I were in one tent, and Carrie was in the other tent, and we had them set up, where we could look out the door and see each other's door, kind of in an L shape. And straight out from our tent, mine and Patty's tent, um, we had a canopy on top of above like a little porch area, I guess, just right out in front of the tent. And straight out through there were trees, and we had hung a big set of chimes that Patty had brought with her. There was a nail sticking way up high. I have a picture of me now. I'm 5'9.5", and I was on a stool on my tippy toes reaching up to try to reach that nail to hang these chimes on. And there's a picture of me doing that. And so the chimes were, they were good size as far as the tubes on them, how far they hung down, but they were up there real high. And we liked that because, well, we thought if anything will mess with them, it'd have to be something big. But we never really dreamed that anything would mess with them. But the night before, when the chime incident happened, the night before, something had walked up to the cooler that we had just outside, under that canopy that we had set up. It was just outside the tent door to the right. It was freezing cold outside. It was in the 20s, and we were both in sleeping bags on a cot on each side of our tent. And Patty had one of those mummy sleeping bags, so she was completely covered. All you could see was her face, and you had to unzip it to get your hands out. Whereas I was inside a sleeping bag, but I didn't have it zipped up, and I had blanket and stuff on top of me. I was covered up like the Princess and the Pea, 20 blankets on top of you. But anyway, so she had heard something out front that sounded like it was right by our cooler. And she was telling me this the next morning, and she said it was very deep guttural breathing, and that it never really messed with the cooler, but it was right there at the cooler. And she was trying to make little noises, trying to wake me up, and I was in a dead sleep. So I didn't wake up. And so anyway, the next day we were more prepared, or the next night, I should say, we were more prepared. We had ran a string from our tent over to Carrie's tent, to where if we heard anything, we could just pull on that string. Supposedly, that was how we thought, it would all happen in our heads, and that she would feel us tugging on it, so she'd know that we were hearing something. But anyway, that second night is when we're laying there. We're all awake because we knew that Patty had heard this breathing, this heavy breathing. And of course, it could have been a bear for all we know, and because there are bear in the area. And so while we're laying there awake, hoping that whatever this was is going to come back, we hear the chimes out front. Now, there's not a lick of wind, not a lick of wind blowing. And so we keep hearing the chimes, and they're not just like ding-a-ling-a-ling a little bit, how if there's a little breeze, chimes will make just real light noise. It wasn't that. It was so loud. And I'm like, oh my gosh. It sounded like something was literally hitting these chimes. And so I decide that I'm going to stand up and peep out, because we always leave those little flaps open so we can peep out. And we always stoke the fire too, so it's still got a huge fire going, and there was a little bit of fire left going. So I'm trying to work up the nerve. Again, this was pretty early on, as we had after we had started our group. This happened relatively early in the beginning, and so I'm trying to tell myself, okay, you can do this. You're brave enough to peep out this door and know that you could see a Bigfoot. And so I'm telling myself that you can do it, Debbie, you can do it. And so I had bent down because we had twinkle lights up too, and I didn't want my shadow or anything to be able to be seen, but we didn't have them along that front wall. So my biggest concern at the time was that my knees were going to pop as I'm standing up, and that it was going to make a sound, and that would alert them and they would leave. So I'm just telling myself, just go slow where your knees don't make any noise. And at the same time, those chimes are still just getting it. So when I do peep out, I'm not, I'm so surprised at what I'm seeing that I can't explain it. And I couldn't wrap my head around it, because I could see the chimes, and they weren't just hanging, like this and just diddling like that. These things were going, if they were hanging straight down like my hand is, normally when the wind blows, they are just doing like this. And if it's heavy wind, they may get a little bit more. But these things, it sounded and looked like something was hitting it from the back, and it had this big, heavy wooden ball in the middle of it. And all of the chimes were going straight up, all of them perfectly still and in the same form as if they were hanging there and no wind was blowing. They would be perfectly still in a circle, but they were perfectly still parallel to the ground. But there was no hands around them holding them. The ball wasn't moving at all. It literally looked like they were just, everything was going like this. But we could hear the chime noises. And we also have that on audio. And I was just staring at it. And I think my mouth must have dropped or something because Patty was like, face it. And I'm taking my fingers and putting them in front of me like this, just going like this. And then looking at her like, I don't, but I still couldn't explain to her what I was seeing because, that doesn't really explain anything. And so I'm watching it and then they just stop. And when they stop, they just kind of do like that a little bit and then they stop. I still don't know how to explain it. But you could hear the chime sounds. So I don't know. I don't, I don't, I don't know. I don't get it. But that was weird and that was very inexplicable. We've had lots of activity in that area. We've gone out there for several years now, off and on. We go less and less, of course, because we've got other areas that have had a lot more activity, and more reoccurring activity. But every now and then we'll go out there, and I can't explain that, Linda. I can't explain that. Just like I can't explain those orbs. And so being able to see that and see that something was making these chimes move because there was not a lick of wind. Something had to have been holding those chimes up somehow. I don't know, but there's got to be something more to what we're experiencing.
For sure.
So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I can understand. That is very odd. I don't think I've ever
yeah,
heard of anything exactly like that. Now, the orb
uh,
thing, maybe parts of that, but that was a multifaceted experience with the orbs because it would change.
yeah,
It was an alternate with other things. And
yeah. And Larry saw it too, the orb, and I don't remember if uh, I think Dan I think Dan might have. Mark had walked off down the road, and I don't think he saw it because he was more in the trees, more so. We were standing in front of that field, so we had a better view. But yeah, there's my thought process on the whole subject has definitely evolved from the beginning of my journey, my Bigfoot journey, to now. And then, of course, me recording the gibberish and knowing that they have a language and they're definitely intelligent creatures. Um,
for sure. And, I think that's true from when you haven't seen a Bigfoot and then you see one. Of course, your whole belief system changes and alters to where you really know that they're real out there. But I think
Definitely.
same thing is true with some of the oddities that happen. You have to experience them before you understand that those might be real possibilities as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating, to say the very least, fascinating.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Debbie, for joining me today. And I appreciate all of your rich information. And it sounds like you are definitely a researcher. You are devoted.
Well, I do love it. I mean, it becomes a fascination, and I go every chance I get. Been very lucky to have good, reliable, friends and research partners, and it's usually just two of us. And we didn't have anything happen this weekend, but it was still a wonderful time camping. So not
Exactly.
only is it fascinating subject, but it's a good way to just relieve a lot of stress.
Yeah, you can never go wrong in nature. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Well, I'm going to let you go and I'll let you know when this comes out.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you.
All right, bye bye.